Is this the character which the present age and contemporary events reveal to us? I direct my attention at once to the most prominent object in this vast picture. It is true that deference to authority has declined, that its lawlessness is unmasked, and although still armed with power, sneaks no dignity any more. Men have awoken from their long lethargy and self-deception, and by an impressive majority they are demanding the restitution of their inalienable rights. Nor are they merely demanding them. On every side they are bestirring themselves to seize by force what has, in their opinion, been wrongfully withheld from them. The fabric of the natural state is tottering, its rotten foundations are yielding, and there seems to be a physical possibility of setting law upon the throne, of honoring man at last as an end in himself and making true freedom the basis of political association. Vain hope! The moral possibility is wanting, and the favorable moment finds an apathetic generation. Man portrays himself in his deeds, and what a form it is that is depicted in the drama of the present day. Here, barbarity, there, innovation, the two extremes of human degeneracy, and both of them united in a single period of time. Among the lower and more numerous classes we find crude, lawless impulses which have been unleashed by the loosening of the bonds of civil order and are hastening with ungovernable fury to their brutal satisfaction. It may be that objective humanity has some cause of complaint concerning the state. Subjective humanity must respect its institutions. Can we blame the state for disregarding the dignity of human nature so long as it was defending its very existence, for hastening to separate by the force of gravity and to link together by the force of cohesion, where there could as yet be no thought of building up? The extinction of the state contains its vindication. Society, uncontrolled, instead of hastening upwards into organic life, is relapsing into its original elements. On the other hand, the civilized classes present to us the still more repugnant spectacle of indolence, and a depravity of character which is all the more shocking, since culture itself is the source of it. I forget which ancient or modern philosopher made the remark that what is more noble is in its corruption the more abominable. But it is equally true in the moral sphere. The child of nature, when he breaks loose, becomes a maniac, the disciple of art an abandoned wretch. The intellectual enlightenment on which the refined ranks of society, not without justification, pride themselves, reveals on the whole an influence upon the disposition so little ennobling that it rather furnishes maxims to confirm depravity. We disown nature in her rightful sphere only to experience her tyranny in the sphere of morality, and in resisting her influences we receive from her our principles. The affected propriety of our manners refuses her the first vote, which would have been pardonable, only to concede to her, in our materialistic moral philosophy, the decisive final say. Selfishness has established its system in the very bosom of our exquisitely refined society, and we experience all the contagions and all the calamities of community without the accompaniment of a communal spirit. We submit our free judgment to its despotic sanction, our feeling to its fantastic customs, our will to its seductions. Only our caprice do we assert against its sacred rights. Proud self-sufficiency contracts, in the worldling, the heart that often still beats sympathetically in the rude natural man, and like fugitives from a burning city, everyone seeks only to rescue his own miserable property from the devastation. Only in a complete abjuration of sensibility may we think to find protection against its abuse, and the ridicule which is often the solitary chastener of the fanatic lacerates the noblest feelings with equally little consideration. So far from setting us free, culture only develops a new want with every power that it bestows on us. The bonds of the physical are tightened ever more alarmingly, so that the fear of loss stifles even the burning impulses towards improvement, and the maxim of passive obedience passes for the supreme wisdom of life. So we see the spirit of the time fluctuating between perverseness and brutality, between unnaturalness and mere nature, between superstition and moral unbelief, and it is only the equilibrium of evil that still occasionally sets balance to it. Have I perhaps overdone this description of the age? I do not anticipate that objection, but rather a different one, that I have proved too much by it. This picture, you will tell me, certainly resembles contemporary humanity, but it also resembles any people at all that is in process of civilization, since all without distinction must fall away from nature through over subtlety of intellect before they can return to her through reason. But if we pay any attention to the character of the age, we must be astonished at the contrast we shall find between the present form of humanity and the bygone one, in particular the Greek. Our reputation for culture and refinement, which we justly stress in considering every mere state of nature, will not serve our turn in regard to the Greek nature, which united all the attractions of art and all the dignity of wisdom, without, however, becoming the victim of them as does our own. The Greeks put us to shame not only by their simplicity, which is alien to our age, they are at the same time our rivals, often indeed our models, in those very excellences with which we are wont to console ourselves for the unnaturalness of our manners, combining fullness of form with fullness of content, at once philosophic and creative, at the same time tender and energetic. We see them uniting the youthfulness of fantasy with the manliness of reason and the splendid humanity. At that time, in that lovely awakening of the intellectual powers, the senses and the mind had still no strictly separate individualities, for no dissension had yet constrained them to make hostile partition with each other and determine their boundaries. Poetry had not yet courted wit, and speculation had not prostituted itself by sophistry. Both of them could, if need arose, exchange their functions, because each in its own fashion honored truth. However high reason might soar, it always drew its subject matter lovingly after it, and however fine and sharp the divisions it made, it never mutilated. It certainly split up human nature and scattered its magnified elements abroad among the glorious assembly of the gods, but not by tearing it in pieces, rather by combining it in varying ways, for the whole of humanity was never lacking in any single god. How completely different it is with us moderns. With us, too, the image of the race is scattered on an amplified scale among individuals, but in a fragmentary way, not in different combinations, so that you have to go the rounds from individual to individual in order to gather the totality of the race. With us, one might almost be tempted to assert, the mental faculties show themselves detached in operation as psychology separates them in idea, and we see not merely individual persons but whole classes of human beings developing only a part of their capacities, while the rest of them, like a stunted plant, show only a feeble vestige of their nature. Do not fail to appreciate the advantages to which the present generation, considered as a unity and weighed in the scales of reason, may lay claim in the face of the best of antiquity, but it has to enter the contest in close order and let whole compete with whole. What individual modern will emerge to contend in single combat with the individual Athenian for the prize of humanity? Whence comes this disadvantageous relation of individuals in spite of all the advantages of the race? Why was the individual Greek qualified to be the representative of his time, and why may the individual modern not dare to be so? Because it was all uniting nature that bestowed upon the former, and all dividing intellect that bestowed upon the latter, their respective forms. It was culture itself that inflicted this wound upon modern humanity. As soon as enlarged experience and more precise speculation made necessary a sharper division of the sciences on the one hand, and on the other, the more intricate machinery of states made necessary a more rigorous dissociation of ranks and occupations, the essential bond of human nature was torn apart, and a ruinous conflict set its harmonious powers at variance. The intuitive and the speculative understanding took up hostile attitudes upon their respective fields, whose boundaries they now begun to guard with jealousy and distrust. And by confining our activity to a single sphere, we have handed ourselves over to a master who is not infrequently inclined to end up by suppressing the rest of our capacities. While in one place a luxuriant imagination ravages the hard-earned fruits of the intellect, in another the spirit of abstraction stifles the fire at which the heart might have warmed itself and the fancy been enkindled. This disorder, which art and learning began in the inner man, was rendered complete and universal by the new spirit of government. It was not indeed to be expected that the simple organization of the first republics would outlive the ingenuousness of their early manners and conditions. But instead of rising to a higher animal life, it degenerated to a common and clumsy mechanism. That zoophyte character of the Greek states, where every individual enjoyed an independent life and, when need arose, could become a whole in himself, now gave place to an ingenious piece of machinery, in which, out of the botching together of a vast number of lifeless parts, a collective mechanical life results. State and church, law and customs were now torn asunder. Enjoyment was separated from labor, means from ends, effort from reward, eternally chained to only one single little fragment of the whole. Man himself grew to be only a fragment. With the monotonous noise of the wheel he drives everlastingly in his ears, he never develops the harmony of his being, and instead of imprinting humanity upon his nature, he becomes merely the imprint of his occupation, of his science. But even the meager fragmentary association which still links the individual members to the whole does not depend on forms which present themselves spontaneously. For how could such an artificial and clandestine piece of mechanism be entrusted to their freedom, but is assigned to them with scrupulous exactness by a formula in which their free intelligence is restricted? The lifeless letter takes the place of the living understanding, and a practiced memory is a surer guide than genius and feeling. If the community makes function the measure of man, when it respects in one of its citizens only memory, another a tabulating intellect, and a third only mechanical skill, if indifferent to character, it here lays stress upon knowledge alone, and there pardons the profoundest darkness of the intellect, so long as it coexists with a spirit of order and a law-abiding demeanor. If at the same time it requires these special aptitudes to be exercised with an intensity proportionate to the loss of extension which it permits in individuals concerned, can we then wonder that the remaining aptitudes of the mind become neglected in order to bestow every attention upon the only one which brings in honor and profit? We know indeed that vigorous genius does not make the boundaries of its concern the boundaries of its activity, but mediocre talent consumes the whole meager sum of its strength in the concern that falls to its lot, and it must be no ordinary head that has something left over for private pursuits without prejudice to its vocation. Moreover, it is seldom a good recommendation with the state when powers exceed commissions, or when the higher spiritual requirements of the man of genius furnish a rival to his office. So jealous is the state for the exclusive possession of its servants, that it will more easily bring itself, and who can blame it, to share its man with the Cytherean than with the Uranian Venus. And so gradually individual concrete life is extinguished, in order that the abstract life of the whole may prolong its sorry existence, and the state remains eternally alien to its citizens, because nowhere does feeling discover it. Compelled to disburden itself of the diversity of its citizens by means of classification, and to receive humanity only at second hand by representation, the governing section finally loses sight of it completely, confounding it with a mere patchwork of the intellect, and the governed cannot help receiving coldly the laws which are addressed so little towards themselves. Finally, weary of maintaining a bond which is so little alleviated for it by the state, positive society disintegrates, as has long since been the fate of the majority of European states, into a moral state of nature, where open force is only one more party, hated and eluded by those who make it necessary, and respected only by those who can dispense with it. With this twofold force pressing on it from within and without, could humanity really take any other course than the one it actually has taken? While the speculative spirit strove after imperishable possessions in the realm of ideas, it had to become a stranger in the material world and relinquish matter for the sake of form. The business spirit, confined in a monotonous circle of objects and inside these still further restricted by formulas, was forced to see the freedom of the whole snatched from under its eyes, and at the same time to become impoverished in its own sphere, as the former is tempted to fashion the actual according to the conceivable, and to exalt the subjective conditions of its imagination into laws constituting the existence of things. So the latter plunged into the opposite extreme of estimating all experience whatsoever by a particular fragment of experience, and trying to apply the rules of its own occupation indiscriminately to every occupation. One fell a victim to a vain subtlety, the other to a narrow pedantry, because the former stood too high to see the individual, and the latter too low to see the whole. But the deleterious effect of this tendency of mind was not restricted to knowledge and utterance alone. It extended not less to feeling and action. We know that the sensibility of the mind depends for its degree upon liveliness, and for its extent upon the richness of the imagination. But the predominance of the analytical faculty must necessarily deprive the fancy of its strength and its fire, and a restricted sphere of objects must diminish its wealth. Hence the abstract thinker very often has a cold heart, since he analyzes the impressions which really affect the soul only as a whole. The man of business has very often a narrow heart, because his imagination, confined within the monotonous circle of his profession, cannot expand to unfamiliar modes of representation. I have been concerned to reveal the pernicious tendency of our contemporary character and its source, not to show the advantages by which nature makes amends for it. I will gladly concede to you that, little as individuals could derive any profit from this dismemberment of their being, yet the race could have made progress in no other way. The phenomenon of Greek humanity was undoubtedly a maximum which could neither be maintained at that pitch nor be surpassed. Not maintained, because the intellect was inevitably bound to be compelled by the store which it already possessed to disassociate itself from sensation and contemplation, and to survive after clearness of knowledge, and also not surpassed, because only to a certain degree is clarity compatible with fullness and warmth. This degree the Greeks had attained, and if they wanted to advance to a higher state of development, they were, like ourselves, obliged to surrender the wholeness of their being and pursue truth along separate roads. There was no other way of developing the manifold capacities of man than by placing them in opposition to each other. This antagonism of powers is the great instrument of culture, but it is only the instrument, for as long as it persists, we are only on the way towards culture. Only by individual powers in man becoming isolated and arrogating to themselves an exclusive right of legislation do they come into conflict with the truth of things, and compel popular opinion, which ordinarily rests with indolent satisfaction upon outward appearance, to penetrate the depth of objects. While the pure intellect usurps authority in the world of sense, and the empirical intellect is engaged in subjecting it to the conditions of experience. Both capacities develop to the utmost degree of maturity and exhaust the whole extent of their sphere. While in one the imagination dares, through its caprice, to dissolve the universal order, in the other it compels the reason to climb to the highest sources of knowledge, and to summon to aid the law of necessity against that order. Partiality in the exercise of powers, it is true, inevitably leads the individual into error, but the race to truth. Only by concentrating the whole energy on our spirit in one single focus, and drawing together our whole being into one single power, do we attach wings, so to say, to this individual power and lead it artificially beyond the bounds which nature seems to have imposed upon it. As surely as all human individuals taken together with the power of vision which nature has granted them would never succeed in observing a satellite of Jupiter which the telescope reveals to the astronomer, so beyond question is it that human reflection would never have achieved an analysis of the infinite or critique of pure reason, unless reason had become dismembered among the several relevant subjects, as it were wrenched itself loose from all matter and strengthened its gaze into the absolute by the most intense abstraction. But will such a spirit resolve, so to say, into pure intellect and pure contemplation, be capable of exchanging the rigid fetters of logic for the free gait of imagination, and of apprehending the individuality of things with just and pure intention? Nature here sets, even to the universal genius, a limit which it cannot pass, and truth will make martyrs so long as philosophy still holds it to be her principal business to provide against error. Thus, however much may be gained for the world as a whole by this fragmentary cultivation of human powers, it is undeniable that the individuals whom it affects suffer under the curse of this universal aim. Athletic bodies are certainly developed by means of gymnastic exercises, but only through the free and equable play of the limbs is beauty formed. In the same way, the exertion of individual talent certainly produces extraordinary men. In the same way, the exertion of individual talent certainly produces extraordinary men, but only their even tempering makes full and happy men. And in what relation should we stand to past and future ages if the cultivation of human nature made such a sacrifice necessary? We should have been the bond slaves of humanity. We should have drudged for it for centuries on end, and branded upon our mutilated nature the shameful traces of this servitude, in order that a later generation might devote itself in blissful indolence to the care of its moral health, and develop the free growth of its humanity. But can man really be destined to neglect himself for any end whatever? Should nature be able, by her designs, to rob us of a completeness which reason prescribes to us by hers? It must be false that the cultivation of individual powers necessitates the sacrifice of their totality, or however much the law of nature did have that tendency, we must be at liberty to restore by means of a higher art this wholeness in our nature which art has destroyed.